She heard the knock before she saw him. 3 soft taps against the cabin's old wooden door. They were so gentle, so faint, they might have just been the wind sighing through the pines, or maybe a branch, heavy with snow, tapping against the glass. For a woman living alone at the edge of the world, every sound was a question. Every whisper of wind was a ghost. Nora had learned to ignore them all. But this sound was different. It was deliberate. It was patient. It was a sound that knew she was inside. She stood frozen in the middle of her small, cold cabin. The fire in the hearth was little more than a pile of glowing orange embers, fighting a losing battle against the chill seeping through the walls. Her heart, a small, tight knot in her chest, began to pound a frantic rhythm against her ribs. No one came out this far. Not anymore. Not since the winter had swallowed the trail and her husband's grave. The knock came again. 3 soft taps. Tap, tap, tap. It wasn't demanding, it wasn't angry, it was just there, waiting. Taking a deep, shaky breath, Nora clutched the heavy iron poker from the fireplace. It was cold and solid in her hand. A poor weapon, but the only comfort she had. She crept to the door, her bare feet silent on the rough-hewn floorboards. Peering through a tiny crack in the wood, she saw nothing but the swirling white of the blizzard. The world had been erased. Maybe it was just the wind. Maybe the loneliness was finally making her imagine things. She was about to turn away, to convince herself it was nothing, when she heard a voice. A small voice, barely a whisper, carried on the wind. "Please." Her blood ran cold. It was the voice of a child. Slowly, her fingers trembling, Nora slid the heavy bolt back. The iron groaned in protest. She pulled the door open just a crack, the freezing air rushing in like an invading army, and what she saw on her doorstep made her forget how to breathe. It was a boy, no older than 10. He was Lakota, with dark, solemn eyes and 2 long braids soaked with melting snow. He was barefoot. Standing barefoot in a foot of fresh snow, his small feet blue with cold. But that wasn't the thing that stole the air from her lungs. It was what he was holding. In his arms, wrapped in a tattered, blood-soaked piece of hide, was a coyote. Its fur was matted and dark with blood, its body limp and broken. Its breathing was a series of shallow, rattling gasps. It was dying. There was no question about it. A small, wild creature, dying in the arms of a small, wild-looking boy on the doorstep of a woman who had forgotten what it felt like to care about anything living at all. Nora's words were trapped in her throat. She hadn't spoken to another human being in weeks. Not since she had buried the last of her wedding silver beneath a flat river stone, a final farewell to the woman she used to be. The silence had become a part of her, a heavy cloak she wore day and night. The boy looked up at her, his eyes locking onto hers. They were ancient eyes, full of a sorrow too deep for a child. He didn't look at her with fear or desperation. He looked at her with a quiet, unnerving certainty. "Please," he said again, his voice cracking. "You help him." It wasn't a question, it was a statement. As if he had walked through miles of unforgiving wilderness, led by the absolute conviction that when he reached this specific door, the woman inside would open it, and she would help. Something inside Nora, something she thought had died and turned to dust long ago, flickered. Against every instinct that screamed at her to slam the door, to bolt it shut and pretend this never happened, she found herself stepping aside. She didn't ask his name. He didn't offer it. The boy shuffled past her, leaving a trail of melting snow and blood on her floor. He moved with a purpose that was chilling, walking straight to the hearth as if he had been in this room 100 times before. He gently, so gently, laid the dying coyote down on an old, empty feed sack she kept by the fire. Nora knelt beside him. The animal's golden eyes were glazed with pain, but they blinked slowly when she reached out a hesitant hand. The wound on its flank was deep and vicious. It wasn't a clean bite from another animal. It wasn't the cruel snap of a steel trap. It looked wrong, jagged, torn. She pressed a clean cloth to the gash. Her fingers, usually so steady from years of mending and darning, now trembled uncontrollably. The boy sat cross-legged in the corner, a silent, watchful statue. He didn't flinch when she threaded a needle with gut. He didn't make a sound as she began to stitch the ragged edges of the skin together. He didn't cry. But she did. Silent, hot tears streamed down her face, tears she hadn't shed for her husband, for her lost future, for her own desolate loneliness. She wiped them away with the back of her hand, ashamed. She wasn't crying for the coyote. She wasn't even crying for the strange, lost boy. She was crying because, for the first time in a very long time, someone had looked at her and believed she could still fix something that was broken, and she was terrified they were wrong. When she finished, the stitching was clumsy, but it held. The bleeding had stopped. The coyote's breathing was still shallow, a fragile thread that could snap at any moment. "He might not make it through the night," she whispered, her voice rough from disuse. The boy just gave a small, solemn nod, as if he had already accepted that possibility. He stood up, walked to the door, and paused with his hand on the latch. For a heart-stopping moment, Nora thought he was going to walk back out into the blizzard and disappear forever, leaving her with this dying creature and the ghost of his visit. But he didn't. He turned back, his dark eyes seeming to pierce right through her. "You're kind," he whispered. "My mama was kind." Then he reached into a small satchel slung over his shoulder, something she hadn't even noticed before. He pulled out a piece of hide, half woven with sinew. It was a small, unfinished blanket. "I make this for him. For the cold." He laid the tiny blanket over the coyote, and as he did, Nora felt a profound and inexplicable shift deep within her soul. It felt like a locked door, rusted shut for years, had just creaked open an inch. She didn't know his name. She didn't know where he came from. But in that moment, she knew with a certainty that shook her to her core that they were both lost souls who had just stumbled upon the same flickering fire, and she had a terrible sinking feeling that the storm that had brought him to her door was nothing compared to the storm that was about to follow. The boy, whose name she still didn't know, fell asleep curled up near the hearth. His thin body was a fragile arc of exhaustion, his arms folded under his cheek. The coyote, a still and silent form, was nestled close to him, tucked beneath the small hide blanket he'd brought. The firelight danced across their faces, casting long, flickering shadows that made them look like a single, ancient carving of loss and survival. Nora hadn't meant for him to stay. Her plan, if you could call it that, was simple: stitch the animal, give the boy a piece of bread, and send him on his way. It was an act of basic human decency, nothing more, a transaction. But when the time came, the words wouldn't form. She couldn't do it. She couldn't send him back out into that howling white emptiness. Not after she saw the way he gently touched the coyote's ear just before he drifted off to sleep, whispering something soft and low in his own language, a sound so full of love and sorrow that it made the wounded animal stop its trembling. So she sat in her rocking chair in the darkest corner of the room, watching them. The rocking chair her husband had made for her. The chair she hadn't been able to sit in for months because the silence was too loud. Tonight, it didn't creak. It just swayed, a silent witness. There was something about the two of them, the boy and the beast, that struck a painful chord deep inside her. They looked like two creatures who had learned the hard way not to expect warmth, not to ask for comfort. And now, having stumbled upon it by accident, they clung to it, sharing a small circle of light in a world of darkness. It was a fragile piece, and Nora knew with a bone-deep certainty that it wouldn't last. Morning arrived not with sunlight, but with more snow. Thick, heavy flakes fell from a gray sky, piling up in deep drifts against her door and windows, sealing them in. The world outside had vanished, replaced by a silent, suffocating whiteness. The coyote was the first to stir. It tried to lift its head, let out a weak whimper, and then collapsed back onto the sack, its sides heaving with effort. Nora rushed over, her heart in her throat. She pressed her ear to its chest. The breathing was faint, but it was there, steadier than the night before. She was shocked by the wave of relief that washed over her. It was a dangerous feeling, this hope. Hope was a trap. The boy woke without a sound. He didn't cry out or rub the sleep from his eyes. He just opened them, and they were instantly alert, ancient and aware. He moved to the coyote's side, his small hands adjusting the hide blanket with a practiced, gentle precision. Then he looked up at her. His gaze was so direct, so knowing, it made her feel as if he could see every crack in her broken heart. "Your hands are strong," he said, his voice clear in the quiet room, "but they're soft now." Nora blinked, taken aback. No one had called her soft in years. Not since her husband John was alive. Not since she had lost the baby, a tiny, secret sorrow that no one in the town had even known about. After John died, after the baby was gone, the world had hardened her. Her hands were for hauling water, chopping wood, and burying things. They were tools, not instruments of comfort. The people from the town stopped coming around after that. A woman alone, with no man and no child, was like a blighted tree. Unnatural. Unlucky. She was an inconvenience, a sad story they preferred to forget. "You're not from the reservation, are you?" she asked, changing the subject. Her voice was sharper than she intended. He shook his head slowly. "I walked a long time. Someone said a woman lived here. Someone said you had healing hands." A bitter laugh escaped her lips. "They lied," she muttered, turning away to stoke the fire. "My hands don't heal anything. Look at it. It's still half dead." The boy stood up. He walked towards her, his bare feet making no sound on the floorboards. He stopped just in front of her, so close she could feel the faint warmth radiating from his small body. "But you tried," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "And nobody else did." The words hit her with the force of a physical blow. She staggered back a step, leaning against the cold stone of the hearth. Outside, the wind howled, a lonely, mournful sound. In the distance, a wolf pack answered its call. The world was full of wild, hungry things, and somehow 2 of them had ended up in her house. She looked from the fire to the boy. "What's your name?" she asked, the words tasting strange on her tongue. He hesitated for a long moment, as if weighing the cost of giving her this one small piece of himself. "Keon," he finally whispered. "Keon." She repeated it silently, the name feeling like a key turning in a lock she didn't know existed. "You'll stay tonight," she said, her voice barely audible. "Just for tonight." Keon simply nodded, his expression unreadable. But Nora had the strangest, most unsettling feeling that he already knew she was lying. That he knew the words, "just for tonight," were a promise she had no intention of keeping. Not anymore. And the most terrifying part was, she didn't want to. That evening, the cabin felt smaller, more crowded. The wind clawed at the shutters, and the snow piled higher and higher, a relentless white tide. Nora found Keon crouched by the fire again. He wasn't sleeping this time, or even tending to the coyote, which now seemed to be resting more peacefully. He was just staring into the flames, his face illuminated by their hypnotic dance, as if he were reading a story in the embers. She moved quietly and crouched down beside him. The silence between them wasn't awkward. It was full. "You're always this quiet?" she asked, her voice soft. He shrugged, his eyes never leaving the fire. "Not much to say when folks don't ask." A small, sad smile touched Nora's lips. "Fair enough." The coyote's tail gave a small, sleepy twitch. It was dreaming. Keon reached out a finger and traced a symbol in the thick layer of ash on the hearthstone. Nora leaned in closer to see. It was a strange shape, a series of curves and sharp angles, like a bird caught in mid-flight, or maybe a falling star. "It's his name," Keon said, his voice a low murmur. He nodded toward the sleeping coyote. "His spirit name. We don't speak it, not until he wakes for good." Nora stared at the symbol. Even as she watched, the heat from the fire began to warp its edges, the ashes shifting and crumbling, erasing the name as quickly as it had been drawn. It felt like a secret she had only been allowed to glimpse for a second. "What does it mean?" she whispered. Keon's gaze shifted from the fire to her. There was a darkness in his eyes now, a shadow that hadn't been there before. "It means he is the last one." He said it so simply, so matter-of-factly, but the words hung in the air like a death sentence. It sounded like both a warning and a prayer. The last of what? His kind, his family. Nora didn't know what to say to that. The weight of his words was too heavy, so she did the only thing she could think to do. She went to her small pantry, found the last of her cornmeal, and made him a piece of cornbread. She even opened the last jar of blackberry jam, the one she'd been saving for a special occasion that she knew would never come. She placed the plate and the small jar beside him on the hearth. As she did, his small cold fingers brushed against her hand. The touch was electric. "You live here all alone," he said. It wasn't a question. It was another one of his quiet, unnerving observations. "Why?" The question was a clean, sharp knife, cutting straight to the heart of her pain. "Because life decided I should," she answered, her voice hollow. "And I didn't argue." He considered this for a long moment, his young face serious. "That's not the same as choosing." "No," she whispered, her throat tightening. "It's not." He nodded slowly, as if her answer confirmed something he already suspected. He took a bite of the cornbread, his eyes closing for a moment in quiet appreciation. "You're kind to him," she said, nodding at the coyote. She needed to change the subject, to move away from the dangerous cliff edge of her own sorrow. Not many boys your age would care so much about a wild animal. Keon looked at her then, and the expression in his eyes was so full of grief and loss that it made her breath catch in her chest. "He's my only blood left," he said, his voice trembling for the first time. Nora felt the room tilt. "What? What do you mean?" "When they burned our home," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, his gaze fixed on the flames in front of him. "He ran back into the fire. To find me. I was trapped. I pulled him out before the roof fell." The image exploded in Nora's mind, vivid and horrifying. A burning cabin. A small boy and a coyote pup, surrounded by smoke and terror. "And your parents?" she asked, already knowing the answer. He didn't need to say the words. The silence was his answer. His small hand, resting on the coyote's flank, began to tremble. "I walked for 4 days," he continued, his voice flat, devoid of emotion, as if he were reciting a story that had happened to someone else. "Then I followed a bird, a black and white bird. It landed on your roof." He looked directly at her now, and the intensity in his gaze was overwhelming. He looked at her as if she was supposed to understand the significance of that. A black and white bird, her roof, as if it weren't a random chance, but a sign, a destination. And the craziest part was, for some reason she couldn't possibly explain, a part of her did understand. Ever since she had opened her door to this strange, sad boy and his dying creature, the cabin had changed. The oppressive silence was gone. The air felt different. It no longer felt like a tomb where she was slowly waiting to die. It felt like something inside these four walls had started breathing again, and she was terrified it was her. That night, after Keon had finally fallen into a deep, exhausted sleep beside the Coyote, Nora found herself sitting by the dying fire, clutching something in her hand. It was a feather, a single, perfect feather, black and white. She had found it tucked under her own pillow when she went to her bed. It hadn't been there the night before, she was sure of it. It wasn't the rough feather of a barn owl or a turkey vulture, the kind that usually circled her desolate patch of land. This one was different. It was sleek, almost unnaturally clean, the black and white markings as sharp and precise as if they had been painted on by an artist's brush. She turned it over and over in her palm, the smooth quill cool against her skin. Had Keon put it there, a silent thank you, or had it appeared by some other means? The thought sent a shiver down her spine. The rational part of her mind, the part that had survived by being practical and hard, told her it was just a feather. But another part, a deeper, more ancient part she didn't know she possessed, felt the weight of it. It felt like a message. The wind howled outside, a wild, hungry sound, but inside the cabin it was strangely warm. It was a deep, penetrating warmth that seemed to come from more than just the glowing embers in the hearth. It felt like the warmth of a living presence. Suddenly, the Coyote stirred. It let out a low, guttural whine, a sound of distress. Keon, still half asleep, mumbled something in his own language. It wasn't a cry of fear. It sounded like comfort, like a memory spoken aloud. Nora watched, mesmerized, as the boy sat up, his eyes still closed. He began to whisper names. Not English names, not the names of saints or presidents she'd read in her books. They were older words, words that felt like they were pulled from the earth itself. His hand rested protectively on the Coyote's side, and in the flickering firelight, she saw something shift in his posture. For a fleeting, surreal moment, he didn't look like a 10-year-old boy. He looked ancient. He looked like a guardian, the last keeper of a sacred trust, the final, fragile thread of a story that hadn't been spoken aloud in generations. She quickly stepped back, her heart hammering against her ribs, and retreated to her chair, clutching the feather so tightly her knuckles turned white. What was she doing? What in God's name was she doing? She had taken in a strange boy she knew nothing about, a boy who spoke to dying animals in a forgotten tongue. She had fed him the last of her precious jam. She was praying over a half-dead coyote as if its survival held some kind of cosmic significance. This was madness. But then she looked around the small, cramped cabin. What had her life been before this? Endless days of canning vegetables she would eat alone. Rocking in an empty chair, staring out the window, watching the wind flatten the dead grass. Counting the hours until she could sleep, and then counting the hours until she had to wake up again. She hadn't spoken to another human being in months, hadn't felt the touch of another hand that wasn't a ghost from her past. Maybe this wasn't madness. Maybe this was the opposite of madness. At dawn, she was startled awake by the sound of soft footsteps. Through the frosted window, she saw Keon. He was outside, standing barefoot in the frost-covered grass, his arms stretched wide towards the pale rising sun. And beside him, standing on 3 legs, was the Coyote. It was limping, its head was low, but it was alive. It was standing. Nora wrapped her thick wool shawl around her shoulders and stepped out onto the cold porch. The morning air was crisp and clean. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice raspy. Keon didn't turn around. His gaze remained fixed on the horizon. "Giving thanks." "For what?" she asked, confused. The animal was still injured. They were still trapped by the snow. What was there to be thankful for? He finally turned to face her. His eyes, though tired, seemed to shine with an inner light. "For you," he said simply. Then he crouched down beside the Coyote and began to rub something into its fur near the wound. It was a poultice of dark, crushed herbs. Herbs she hadn't given him. Herbs she didn't recognize. Herbs he must have found himself, somewhere in this frozen, barren landscape. A knot tightened in Nora's chest. This was getting too complicated, too deep. She wasn't this boy's mother. She wasn't his savior. She was just a lonely woman in a cabin. But the way the earth itself seemed to quiet around him, the way the wind seemed to listen when he prayed, it made her wonder. It made her wonder if she hadn't just taken in a lost boy. It made her wonder if she had been chosen to shelter something holy without ever knowing why. And that thought was more terrifying than any blizzard. That evening, as the sun began its slow descent, painting the western sky in strokes of orange and purple, Nora stepped outside to bring in a few pieces of laundry she'd hung on a line near the door. She was gathering the stiff, frozen cloth when a movement at the far edge of the clearing caught her eye. She stopped cold. Her hands froze on the line. There, standing at the edge of the trees, was a figure, a tall man, his silhouette sharp and dark against the snow. He wasn't moving. He wasn't speaking. He was just watching the cabin. He was too far away to make out any details, but the shape was unmistakable. He wore what looked like long buckskins, and there was something slung across his back. A bow? A rifle? Nora's breath hitched in her throat. Her mind raced. Who was he? A hunter? A trapper? Or was he something else? Was he one of them? The ones who had burned Keon's home? She ducked back, her heart pounding a frantic drum against her ribs. She glanced over her shoulder, towards the cabin. Through the window, she could see Keon. He was inside, humming a low, tuneless song to himself while he used a smooth stone to grind some roots in a wooden bowl. The coyote lay at his feet, its head buried under its paws, fast asleep. They were safe. For now. Her gaze snapped back to the tree line. The man was gone, vanished, as if he had been a phantom, a trick of the fading light. But she knew he had been real. She had felt his eyes on her. She waited for another minute, then two, her eyes scanning the dark woods. Nothing. Just the endless pines and the creeping shadows of twilight. Slowly, cautiously, she gathered the rest of the laundry and hurried back inside, her heart still hammering. She slid the heavy bolt across the door, the sound echoing in the sudden silence of the cabin. "Keon," she said, trying to keep her voice gentle, casual. Do you know anyone who might come looking for you? Anyone at all?" He glanced up from his work, his expression calm, not startled in the least. "I dreamt my uncle found me," he said quietly. The knot in Nora's stomach tightened. "And is he a kind man?" Keon's eyes flickered towards the fire. "He used to be." That single, chilling phrase did nothing to settle her nerves. It only made them worse. Later that night, as the oil lamps burned low and the fire hissed and popped, Nora tried to write in her journal. It was a habit she'd kept since John died, a way to speak when there was no one to listen. But tonight, the words wouldn't come. Her thoughts just kept circling back to the silent figure in the woods, to Keon's cryptic words. He used to be kind. A feeling of dread, cold and heavy, settled over her. Something was drawing near. Something was watching, waiting, measuring. Around midnight, a sound from the hearth startled her. The coyote, which had been sleeping soundly, was suddenly sitting bolt upright. Its ears were pricked forward, its body tense. A low, menacing growl rumbled deep in its chest, a sound that made the hair on Nora's arms stand on end. She rose silently from her chair and crept to the window, peering through a small gap in the shutters. Outside, the world was bathed in the cold blue light of the moon. She saw nothing but the still, snow-covered clearing, the dark shapes of the pine trees, and the brilliant, indifferent stars. But the coyote would not lie down. It remained on high alert, its golden eyes fixed on the door. Keon sat up beside it, his movements slow and deliberate. He wrapped an arm around the animal's neck and whispered something soft and low into its ear. The growling subsided, but the tension remained. Then, in a voice so soft she could barely hear it, Keon said, "He knows I'm not alone now." Nora turned from the window, her blood running cold. "Who?" she breathed, the question a ghost of a sound in the quiet room. "Who knows?" "The one who walks between the trees," Keon answered, his voice still a whisper. Nora didn't understand the words, but the feeling behind them was unmistakable. It was a feeling of ancient power, of something that did not abide by the rules of her world. "What does that mean, Keon?" "It means he'll wait," the boy said, his eyes dark and serious. "He'll wait until he's sure." "Sure of what?" Nora pressed, her voice trembling. Keon finally turned and looked at her, and the look in his eyes was one of profound, heartbreaking wisdom. It was a look that made her feel both impossibly small and infinitely important, all at the same time. "That you didn't just feed a dying boy," he whispered. "He's waiting to be sure that you kept something alive that belonged to him. He's waiting to see if you deserve to keep it." That night, Nora didn't sleep. She sat in her rocking chair, the black and white feather clutched in her hand, and she listened. She wasn't listening for footsteps anymore. She was listening to the beat of her own heart. She felt claimed, not owned, not trapped, but chosen, as if some unseen force out there in the darkness had been watching her, testing her, and had finally decided she was worthy. And she knew, with a terrifying certainty, that soon he would step out of the shadows and tell her what she had won, or what she had lost. The next morning broke with a heavy frost that traced intricate, fern-like patterns on the window panes. The silence that filled the cabin was different now. It wasn't the lonely silence of before. It was a waiting silence, a silence that held its breath. Nora brewed tea with hands that she couldn't keep from shaking. Her eyes darted constantly to the window, to the edge of the woods, expecting to see the tall, dark figure standing there again. Keon, meanwhile, sat by the fire with the coyote curled up against his leg. The boy and the animal seemed to share a kind of deep, meditative stillness that unnerved her more than any noise ever could. They were ready. Then came the sound. Crunch. A single footstep on the crisp, frozen snow. Then another, and another. Someone was walking towards the cabin, not rushing, not sneaking, just approaching with a slow, deliberate confidence, as if this place, this land, this cabin already belonged to them. Nora's pulse thundered in her ears. She moved to the door, her body acting on an instinct she didn't know she had. She took a deep breath, slid the bolt back, and pulled the door open. She had expected to see a monster. One of the men from Keon's nightmares. The man who used to be kind. But the man standing on her porch was not what she expected at all. He was younger than she had imagined, though clearly not a boy. He was a Lakota warrior, tall and broad-shouldered, with eyes as dark and deep as a winter night. There were scars on his cheek, thin white lines that looked earned, not accidental. His long black braid was tight and neat, though the ends were frayed by the wind. His buckskin clothes were worn and patched, but clean. And his posture. It wasn't prideful or arrogant. It was careful, measured, the posture of a man who understood the weight of his own power. But it was what he was carrying that made Nora's breath catch in her throat. In his arms, he held a small cylindrical bundle, wrapped carefully in rawhide and tied with a string adorned with dark feathers. He didn't speak. He simply held it out to her, an offering, a demand. She didn't know which. Hesitantly, she reached out and took it. The moment her fingers touched the worn leather, a jolt, like a tiny spark of lightning, shot up her arm. The bundle was strangely warm. "What is this?" she asked, her voice a reedy whisper. The man's voice, when he finally spoke, was low and clear, like the sound of stones rolling in a deep river. It was a voice filled with a reverence that seemed to make the very air around them still. "It is the story I could not carry alone," he said. Just then, Keon stepped into the doorway behind her. He stood beside Nora, not hiding, not afraid, just still. He looked up at the tall warrior. "Uncle," he said, his voice quiet but steady. The man's gaze shifted from Nora to the boy. The hard lines of his face softened, and his mouth twitched at the corner. It wasn't quite a smile, but it was something close. A flicker of relief. A hint of wonder. "So," the man said, his eyes searching Keon's face. "You were not a dream." "No," Keon replied. "And she kept you warm?" The man's dark eyes flickered back to Nora. Keon nodded. "And she fed the four-legged one who led me here?" Another nod. Nora looked from the warrior to the boy and back again, feeling like she was caught in the middle of a powerful, invisible current. Her mind was reeling. The coyote? The coyote had led him here? "Why was the coyote with him?" she asked, her voice stronger now. "How did you know?" The man, Keon's uncle, finally turned his full attention to her. His eyes were soft now, but still unreadable, like deep, still pools of water. "That coyote was my brother's spirit animal," he said, his voice resonating with a profound sadness. When he passed, the animal ran. It vanished into the wilderness. No one could catch it. The elders said it would not stop running until it found what remained of my brother's spirit. I have followed its tracks for 3 days. They ended at your door." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. The cold air, the distant mountains, the silent trees, everything shifted. Nora clutched the warm rawhide bundle to her chest as if it were a shield. "And now?" she whispered. "What happens now?" The warrior's gaze held hers, steady and unflinching. "Now," he said, his voice dropping low, "I see if the one who saved my blood is strong enough to carry what comes next. With me." For a long time, no one spoke. The three of them stood on the cabin floor, a strange and unlikely trinity brought together by fate and a wounded animal. The man, whose name Nora learned was Tyen, sat cross-legged on the floor, a mountain of quiet intensity. Keon hovered by the fire, his hand never leaving the coyote's back, which now rose and fell with a slow, peaceful rhythm. And Nora sat across from them, the rawhide bundle resting in her lap. It felt warm, impossibly warm, and it seemed to hum with a life of its own, heavier than its small size should allow. "You do not have to open it," Tyen said, his voice a low, rumbling murmur that seemed to come from the earth itself. "You have done more than any could ask, but the story is not finished. You only need to open it if you choose to know the rest." But Nora knew. In the deepest part of her soul, in a place that had been silent for years, she knew she had to. Her life before this moment had been a story of endings. Her husband's death, her unborn child, her own slow fade into nothingness. This felt different. This felt like a beginning. With fingers that trembled only slightly, she untied the feathered string. She loosened the stiff knots of the rawhide and began to peel back the layers of worn leather. Inside, nestled in a bed of soft rabbit fur, were carvings. Tiny, intricate figures, shaped from bone and stone and wood. She lifted them out one by one. There was a woman with a long braid, her face tilted towards the sky. There was a small child, its arms carved to look like they were reaching upward, full of hope. And there was a coyote, crouched protectively beside them, its eyes made of tiny polished onyx beads that seemed to watch her with a startling intelligence. The last piece in the bundle wasn't a carving. It was a strip of beaded cloth, beautifully stitched with the symbol of a rising sun. But one edge of it was burned, the fabric blackened and singed. Nora's breath caught in her throat. She looked up at Tyann. Keon's father, he carved these? Tyann nodded once, his expression solemn. My brother was many things. A hunter, a scout, a warrior. But most of all, he said, his voice thick with emotion, he was a father. These were for Keon. They are his stories, his legacy, his promise. Nora's fingers trembled as she traced the lines of the small figures. The mother, with a braid just like her own. The child, reaching for a future he would never see. The faithful Coyote, carved with such precision and love. Keon, who had been silent this whole time, edged closer. He used to tell me the stories, he whispered, his small finger reaching out to touch the stone coyote. The story of the first sunrise, the story of the woman who sang to the stars, but he never finished them. He didn't know how they ended, Tyann said softly, his gaze on his nephew. That part was for you to find, little one. Nora looked up, her heart aching with a mixture of wonder and a terrible, crushing weight. The beauty of the carvings, the tragedy of the story they told, it was almost too much to bear. Why, she whispered, her eyes pleading with Tyann, why bring them to me? Tyann's gaze met hers, as steady and unyielding as stone. My brother knew the world was turning dark. He knew there were men who hunted our people, men who saw our traditions as a threat. He was trying to find a safe place for his son, a place of refuge. He paused, taking a deep breath. The coyote did not lead me to a place. It led me to a person. It led me to you. But I don't understand, Nora stammered. I'm nobody. Just a woman in a cabin. No, Tyann said, his voice firm but gentle. You were the one who let the wild come inside. When a child and a dying animal appeared at your door in the middle of a blizzard, you didn't see a threat. You didn't see a burden. You didn't lock the door. You didn't ask for payment. You brought them into the warmth. You gave comfort to the boy, to the creature, to the spirit of my brother. Nora felt her throat tighten, a lump of unshed tears forming. But I'm not one of you. You are, Tyann interrupted, his voice resonating with a quiet power that shook her to her core. Maybe not in blood, but in bone, in spirit. You have the heart of our people. The fire popped, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. The coyote lifted its head, looked around the room at the three faces watching it, and then laid its head back down with a contented sigh. Nora, moved by an impulse she didn't understand, reached out her hand to Keon. He took it without hesitation, his small fingers lacing through hers. What do you want from me? She asked Tyann, the question raw and honest. It wasn't a challenge. It was a plea for truth. Tyann's expression didn't change. His voice didn't rise. It didn't waver. Nothing you haven't already given, he said. But if there is more you wish to give, if you choose to help us write the ending to my brother's story, I would carry that honor with me for the rest of my days. For a long, breathless moment, no one moved. The cabin was filled with the sound of the crackling fire and the whisper of the wind outside. The world felt utterly still, and in that stillness, Nora realized that her own story, the one she thought had ended in ashes and sorrow, was not over. A new chapter was about to begin. That night, Nora stood outside the cabin, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. The cold night air a stark contrast to the warmth that had settled deep in her bones. The moon was a sharp silver sickle in the sky, casting a pale, ethereal light over the snow-covered clearing and the silent, watching pines. Inside, Keon was asleep, curled up beside the coyote, a small, trusting bundle of boy and beast. They looked as if they had been born that way, a perfect picture of peace. Tyann had taken the far corner of the room, near the hearth. He hadn't spoken much after their simple dinner of stew and cornbread, but his presence filled the small space. He was like an old, mighty oak tree, rooted, unmoving, and quietly, powerfully alive. Nora had never imagined this path for herself. When she opened her door to a freezing boy and a dying animal, she thought she was performing a single, isolated act of kindness. She didn't realize she was inviting a family into the empty rooms of her heart. She thought she was just helping a child survive one more night. She didn't know she was agreeing to help raise him. The weight of it all should have been crushing, but instead, it felt right. It pressed against her chest, not with fear, but with a tender, unfamiliar hope. The carvings were sitting on the rough wooden mantel above the fireplace. She had touched them one last time before stepping outside. She had run her thumb over the smooth stone of the mother figure, over the scorched edge of the beaded cloth, and this time she hadn't cried. This time she had smiled. She heard the soft crunch of footsteps on the snow behind her, and turned. Tyann was approaching slowly, giving her the courtesy of space, not wanting to startle her. "You cannot sleep?" he asked, his voice a low murmur. Nora shook her head, pulling her shawl tighter. "Too much in my heart to let it rest." He nodded, a deep understanding in his eyes. He stood beside her, not too close, and looked up at the moon. "When I was a boy," he said quietly, "our elders taught us that a coyote who comes bleeding to your door is more than just an omen." Nora turned to look at him, her curiosity piqued. "It is a question," he continued, his gaze still on the night sky. "The earth itself is asking you a question. It is asking if you are still willing to make room for what is wild, for what is sacred." Nora's eyes widened, the black and white feather, the herbs she didn't recognize, Keon's whispers. It was all starting to connect, forming a picture she was only just beginning to see. "And if you say yes?" she whispered. "What happens then?" Tyann finally looked down at her, and in the pale moonlight, his scarred face was handsome, noble. "Then you are no longer just a woman in a house," he said. "You become part of the story, a story that does not end." They stood in a comfortable silence for a long moment, the only sounds the whisper of the wind through the pine needles and the distant, lonely cry of an owl. "Tyann," she said, her voice slow and careful, "are you going to take him with you?" "I came to see what my brother left behind," he answered honestly, "to honor his memory. But Keon, he carries his own spirit now. He has chosen his path. If he wishes to leave this place, I will guide him. I will protect him with my life. But if he chooses to stay—" Tyann paused, his gaze meeting hers. "I will never try to claim him from a home that has shown him more kindness than the world ever did." A great, shuddering breath escaped Nora's lungs, a breath she didn't even realize she had been holding. The tightness in her chest, the fear that had been her constant companion for so long, finally eased its grip. "And what about you?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Will you be leaving?" His answer wasn't in words. It was in his eyes. It was in the deep, open silence that stretched between them, a silence that asked a question of its own. "That depends," he finally said, his voice low and soft. "It depends on whether your door stays open." She didn't speak. She didn't need to. She simply turned, walked back to the cabin, and placed her hand on the old wooden handle. She looked back at him one last time, a silent promise passing between them. Then she opened the door. It didn't creak this time. It felt like a welcome. Snow had begun to fall again, but it was different from the blizzard that had brought Keon to her. These were soft, gentle flakes, whispering against the cabin roof and clinging to the pine branches like delicate lace. Inside, the fire had burned down to a bed of glowing embers, but the room was filled with a warmth that had nothing to do with the hearth. Keon was sitting up on the rug, the coyote, the wild, unpredictable creature, resting its head peacefully in his lap, its eyes closed in absolute trust. Tien was crouched beside him, his large, scarred hands patiently showing the boy how to sharpen a piece of wood with a sliver of flint, how to work with the grain so it wouldn't splinter. And Nora? Nora sat down at her small wooden table, watching them. The two dark-haired figures, one large and one small, bathed in the soft glow of the firelight. She picked up the boy's old, torn shirt and a needle and thread, and she began to sew. Her hands, which she had once thought were only good for hard labor and burying her past, moved with a new purpose. She wasn't just fixing something that was broken, she was helping to grow something whole. "Why did they call him Red Smoke?" Keon asked suddenly, his voice clear in the quiet room. He pointed with the piece of wood towards the carvings on the mantel. Tien looked up from his work, a rare half-smile playing on his lips. "It was my brother's name," he said. "He was born during a great fire in the high country. The elders said the flames rose to the sky, but the smoke was gentle, and the sky above it stayed calm and blue. They said it was a sign that he was meant to carry great power, but to carry it quietly." Nora looked at the carvings, at the legacy of this quiet, powerful man. "He must have been very strong," she said, "to raise a boy like you." Keon didn't answer right away. He just stroked the coyote's soft fur. "He taught me how to see the things that other people throw away," he said finally, his gaze flicking up to meet Nora's. "He would have liked you." Tien nodded once, a silent, powerful agreement. The quiet settled over them again, but it was a different kind of quiet now. It wasn't lonely or awkward, it was comfortable. It was the quiet of belonging. Nora stood, setting the half-mended shirt aside, and walked to the hearth. She picked up one of the smaller carvings, one that looked unfinished. It was a bird, its wings only partially shaped. "What's this one?" she asked. Tien stood and came to stand beside her. He was so close she could feel the heat from his body, smell the faint scent of pine smoke and winter air that clung to him. "He never told me," he said, his voice low. "I think he carved it during one of the hard winters, a time when we had more hunger than we had hope." Nora traced the rough, unfinished lines of the wings with her finger. Maybe he didn't finish it because he hadn't found the ending to its story yet. Tien looked at her then, and the way his dark eyes held her gaze made her pulse stutter, a frantic little bird in her chest. "And maybe," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "it wasn't his ending to write." She didn't flinch. She didn't look away. "No," she said softly, her voice full of a certainty that amazed her. "Maybe it's ours." Behind them, on the rug, the boy yawned, a wide, sleepy sound. He curled into the warm fur of the creature that had once been wild and dying, the creature that had brought them all together. The fire crackled low. The wind outside had died down, passing the small cabin gently. And Nora knew, without a single vow or ceremony, without a single word being spoken, that this was it. This was the part of the story where the wild things stopped running. This was the part where they came home. By the time spring finally came, chasing the last of the stubborn snow from the hollows, the land around Nora's cabin had transformed. The frozen earth had thawed, soft and dark and ready. Tiny purple and yellow wildflowers pushed their way up along the old fence line, and a pair of bluebirds built a nest under the eaves of the porch. But the change in the land was nothing compared to the change in the three people who lived within the cabin's walls. Tien was no longer the silent, intimidating stranger who had appeared out of the storm. He had built new, sturdy shelves for the pantry. He had repaired and reinforced the fence around the small yard. And one night, when Nora had fallen asleep in her rocking chair reading a book, he had gently taken the book from her lap and laid a second quilt over her, without a word. He never crossed a boundary she didn't invite him to cross. He never asked for anything that she hadn't already offered. But he stayed, and his quiet, constant presence was louder and more meaningful than any declaration of love. Keon had grown. He seemed to have shot up by inches, his face losing some of its boyish roundness. He was taller, stronger, and quicker to laugh. The deep, haunting sadness in his eyes was still there, but now it was balanced by a bright spark of joy. He spoke of his father, of red smoke, with pride now, not just pain. He had taught the Coyote, who he had named Tika, to come to his whistle, and in the evenings he would sit with Nora, his head bent over one of her old, tattered books, as he slowly, painstakingly taught himself how to read. One afternoon, as Nora was patching yet another tear in his shirt sleeve, he leaned his head against her arm. "Do I have to call you Miss Nora forever?" he asked, his voice so quiet she almost didn't hear him. She paused, her needle hovering in midair. Her heart gave a great, painful lurch. "What would you rather call me?" she asked, her own voice unsteady. He didn't meet her eyes. He just stared at the worn floorboards and whispered, "Mama, if that's okay." Her hands began to tremble, the needle and thread falling from her numb fingers. For a long, silent moment, she couldn't breathe. She couldn't speak. All the grief, all the loss, all the emptiness of the years washed over her. The ghost of the baby she never held, the husband she had lost too soon. She reached out and cupped his small cheek in her hand, turning his face towards hers. She couldn't find the words, so she just nodded once. A single, firm, definite nod that said everything. Keon let out a long, shuddering breath, a sound of pure relief, as if he had been holding that question inside himself for years, a heavy stone on his heart. That night, she stood outside with Tayen under a sky so clear it looked like a spill of diamond dust. He was holding the unfinished bird carving. He had been working on it for weeks, a little bit at a time. Now he held it out to her. It was finished. He had carved the wings to look as if they were just about to take flight. "My brother carved this when he felt he had lost his way," Tayen said softly. Nora took the carving from him. It was warm from his hands. "You carved the rest," she replied, her voice full of meaning. Tayen looked at her, really looked at her, his dark eyes filled with a deep and profound emotion. "Some things," he said, his voice low and gravelly, "are too sacred to name." And she understood. She didn't need a wedding. She didn't need a title. She didn't need a piece of paper to tell her what was real. She had a son, a boy who called her Mama. She had a partner, a man who looked at her as if she were the anchor that had finally stopped his wandering. She had a home, not one born of blood, but one built by choice, by courage, by the quiet, stubborn refusal to let the wild things in. Later, as she sat by the fire, Tika the Coyote curled up at her feet, its ribs no longer showing, its golden eyes calm and watchful. She realized that love hadn't come for her like a storm, loud and overwhelming, the way the stories always said it would. It had come quietly. As quiet as paw prints in thawing snow. As quiet as a Lakota boy with a dying animal, asking for the one thing she thought she had lost forever. Her heart. If you were moved by Nora's story and believe in the power of second chances, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more stories that touch the soul. And let us know in the comments, if a child, lost and alone, asked to belong to you when you had nearly forgotten how to be needed, what would you have done?